1 billion streams. That's what Hillsong worship songs generated annually at their peak. Oceans, what a beautiful name. Cornerstone. These songs were sung in churches across the world every single Sunday. Hillsong wasn't just a church. It was a worship empire generating over $100 million annually. Today, Hillsong is bankrupt. The global brand that defined modern worship for 2 decades collapsed in 3 years. 15 of 16 U.S. campuses closed. Worship albums canceled. Tours abandoned. The most influential worship brand in modern Christianity disintegrated. But Hillsong isn't alone. Bethel Music laid off staff and canceled tours. Elevation Worship faces lawsuits and declining revenue. Passion conferences draw smaller crowds. The worship industry that seemed unstoppable, that generated billions and shaped how millions worship, is dying. Today, we're investigating the worship industry collapse. How worship became a billion-dollar business. Why that business is now failing catastrophically. What happens when churches realize the songs they're singing come from collapsed empires. And whether Christian worship music can survive the death of the industry that commercialized it. If you want to understand one of the most significant shifts in contemporary Christianity, subscribe now. Because what's happening to worship music isn't just about Hillsong or Bethel. It's about what happens when ministry becomes industry and industry becomes idol. Let me show you the scale of this collapse with actual data. In 2019, Hillsong Worship's Oceans had been streamed over 1 billion times on Spotify and YouTube combined. Their albums regularly debuted in Billboard's top 10. Their tours sold out arenas globally. By 2024, Hillsong's streaming numbers dropped 45%. Album releases stopped entirely. The brand that once dominated Christian music charts is functionally dead. Churches that sang 6 Hillsong songs every Sunday now avoid them because of the brand's toxicity. Bethel Music's numbers tell similar story. In 2018, they generated an estimated $30 million in annual revenue. Streaming, album sales, conferences, and merchandise made Bethel Music a major Christian music label. By 2023, revenue had dropped by an estimated 50%, forcing layoffs and tour cancellations. CCLI, the licensing service that tracks which songs churches actually sing, reveals the shift. In 2019, 7 of the top 25 worship songs were from Hillsong or Bethel brands. By 2024, only 3 remained in the top 25, and all were older songs from before the scandals. New releases from these brands aren't charting at all. The financial collapse extends beyond these 2 brands. Overall, contemporary worship music album sales dropped 32% between 2019 and 2023. Streaming revenue for worship music declined despite overall music streaming increasing. Conference attendance at major worship events dropped by 20 to 35%. The worship industry generated an estimated $1.2 billion annually at its 2019 peak. By 2024, that number had fallen to approximately $800 million. A 33% collapse in 5 years. And the trajectory suggests the decline is accelerating, not stabilizing. Emily was a worship leader at a mid-sized church in Tennessee for 12 years. She loved leading worship, loved choosing songs that would connect people with God, loved seeing congregations encounter Jesus through music. But over the past 5 years, her job became increasingly complicated. Every song choice became controversial. She'd select a Hillsong song, and church members would complain about Carl Lentz or Brian Houston. She'd choose a Bethel song, and people would object to Bethel's theology. Emily told me, "I'm trying to lead worship, but I'm constantly navigating which songs are canceled this month. People don't hear the lyrics anymore. They hear the brand. They hear the scandal. Songs that helped people worship last year are now divisive because of what the writers or artists did." In 2023, Emily quit worship ministry entirely. She couldn't handle the constant controversy. She couldn't keep up with which worship brands were acceptable and which weren't. And she was exhausted by the realization that worship had become so commodified that the scandals of producers mattered more than the content of songs. Emily now works in healthcare. She occasionally plays guitar at home but refuses to lead worship publicly. "The industry destroyed worship for me," she said. "I can't separate the music from the machine anymore." Multiply Emily's story across America, and you see why worship ministry is in crisis. To understand the collapse, you need to understand the golden age. The modern worship industry was built between 1990 and 2015. Hillsong emerged from Australia in the 1990s with radio-friendly worship songs. Passion conferences, started by Louis Giglio in 1997, created the college worship movement. By the 2000s, worship music was a massive business. Chris Tomlin became the first worship music star. His songs were sung by millions weekly. He sold out concerts. He won Grammys and Dove Awards. Worship music crossed over from church into Christian radio and even mainstream charts. Bethel Music launched in 2010 and brought California charismatic style to global worship. Their songs emphasized intimacy with God, spontaneous worship, and prophetic singing. Within 5 years, Bethel became the second-largest worship brand after Hillsong. Elevation Worship, the music arm of Stephen Furtick's megachurch, emerged in the 2010s. Their production quality rivaled secular music. Their songs were catchy and accessible. By 2015, Elevation songs were in the CCLI Top 100. The worship industry's golden age was characterized by professionalism, production quality, and profit. Worship albums had multi-million-dollar budgets. Tours featured elaborate staging and lighting. Worship leaders became celebrities with social media followings and endorsement deals. Churches participated willingly. They paid CCLI licensing fees to sing industry-produced songs. They bought albums and sent youth groups to conferences. They essentially outsourced their worship songwriting to a handful of brands that industrialized the process. It seemed sustainable. The songs were good. The theology was mostly sound. The production quality was excellent. But the industry built something fragile, worship dependent on brands that could collapse. And when those brands fell, they took the worship industry down with them. Subscribe now if you're starting to see how the commercialization of worship created conditions for catastrophic failure. Because understanding what built the empire explains why it's collapsing so dramatically now. The worship industry's collapse began with Hillsong's implosion. In 2020, Carl Lentz, pastor of Hillsong NYC and the brand's celebrity face, was fired for adultery. The scandal wasn't just about Lentz's personal failure. It revealed a culture of celebrity worship and lack of accountability. Lentz had been Hillsong's American brand, friends with Justin Bieber, featured in media, representing cool Christianity. Then in 2021, multiple women came forward with allegations of abuse and misconduct by Hillsong leaders globally. An independent investigation revealed systemic problems, manipulation, control, and spiritual abuse across multiple Hillsong campuses. The revelations destroyed Hillsong's image as a healthy, spirit-filled church. In 2022, Brian Houston, Hillsong's founder and global senior pastor, was charged with concealing his father's child's sexual abuse. Houston resigned, but the damage was complete. The man who built Hillsong had covered up pedophilia. Churches worldwide began removing Hillsong songs from worship rotations. The financial collapse followed quickly. Attendance at Hillsong churches dropped 50 to 60% between 2020 and 2023. 15 of 16 U.S. campuses closed. The London campus, once Hillsong's European flagship, shut down. By 2024, Hillsong was declaring insolvency in multiple countries. The worship music business collapsed with the church. Hillsong Worship hadn't released a major album since 2021. Tours were canceled. Streaming numbers plummeted as churches stopped using Hillsong songs. The brand that had been worth over $100 million was toxic and worthless. For worship leaders like Emily, the Hillsong collapse created immediate crisis. Oceans had been the most popular worship song in America for 5 years. Suddenly, churches debated whether singing it endorsed abuse. Some churches banned all Hillsong songs. The songs hadn't changed, but the brand had poisoned them. While Hillsong collapsed from scandal, Bethel music faced different but equally damaging problems. Bethel Church in Redding, California had always been controversial because of their charismatic practices. Grave soaking, lying on graves of dead revivalists, glory clouds, and claims of gold dust appearing supernaturally. For years, churches used Bethel songs despite discomfort with Bethel theology. The songs were good even if the church was weird. Goodness of God, The Lion and the Lamb, and King of Kings became staples despite Bethel's reputation. But around 2018 to 2020, discomfort turned to rejection. The New Apostolic Reformation connections became more documented and discussed. Bethel's dominionist theology, the belief Christians should take dominion over society, alarmed more Christians. Bethel's word of faith influences, where faith is treated as force that controls outcomes, troubled theologians. Reformed and conservative evangelical leaders began actively telling churches to avoid Bethel music. The 2019 incident where Bethel tried to resurrect a dead child through worship and prayer became viral news. The family, devastated by their toddler's death, was encouraged by Bethel to believe resurrection was possible. When resurrection didn't happen, outsiders saw the incident as cruel manipulation of grieving parents. By 2020 to 2021, major denominations and churches were formally discouraging Bethel music. The Southern Baptist Convention, Presbyterian Church in America, and others warned about Bethel's theology. Even charismatic churches uncomfortable with Bethel's excesses started removing their songs. Bethel Music's revenue collapsed. They laid off staff in 2022 and 2023. Tours were scaled back or canceled. Album releases slowed. The brand that had seemed unstoppable was now associated with theological error and manipulation. Churches faced Emily's dilemma: great songs from a problematic source. Elevation Worship, the third major brand, faced its own crisis. Stephen Furtick's Elevation Church had always been controversial. The staged baptism scandal in 2014, where volunteers were told to get baptized to inspire others, damaged credibility. Furtick's 16,000-square-foot house and refusal to disclose salary raised prosperity gospel concerns. But Elevation Worship's production quality was so good that churches overlooked the controversy. Oh, Come to the Altar, Do It Again, and Graves into Gardens were too popular to abandon. Elevation understood Christian radio formatting better than anyone and produced accessible, radio-friendly worship. Around 2022 to 2023, scrutiny intensified. Investigations into Elevation's finances raised questions about how worship revenue was used. Reports suggested Elevation Worship operated as for-profit entity funneling revenue back to Furtick's church and personal ventures. The line between ministry and business became indistinguishable. Lawsuits emerged from former Elevation staff and members alleging financial manipulation and spiritual abuse. The pattern resembled Hillsong: charismatic leader, minimal accountability, financial opacity, and people harmed. Though Elevation Worship's music remained popular, the brand was tainted. Worship leaders began avoiding new Elevation releases. Churches questioned whether using Elevation songs endorsed Furtick's ministry. Elevation Worship didn't collapse like Hillsong, but it stopped growing and faced increasing resistance. The third pillar of the worship industry was damaged, further destabilizing the entire system. The collapse of individual brands revealed systemic problems in the worship industry structure. First, the celebrity worship leader model was broken. Worship leaders became Christian celebrities with massive platforms. But celebrity status corrupts. The same dynamics that destroy celebrity pastors destroyed worship leaders. When worship leaders became brands, their personal failures destroyed the music they created. The songs became inseparable from the singers. The theology became inseparable from the theological errors of the brands. Worship that should have been about Jesus became about the people producing it. Second, the commercialization of worship created perverse incentives. Worship brands needed to constantly produce new content. But great worship songs are rare. Forcing annual album releases produced mediocre songs designed for radio play rather than congregational worship. The songs were written for commercial success, not for helping churches worship. Third, the industry concentrated worship songwriting in too few hands. 5 or 6 brands provided most contemporary worship songs. When those brands failed, the entire contemporary worship catalog became suspect. Churches had outsourced worship creativity to an industry that collapsed. Fourth, the financial model was exploitative. Churches paid licensing fees to sing songs from multimillion-dollar worship empires. Small churches with tight budgets sent money to megachurch worship brands that spent it on tours and celebrity lifestyles. The financial flow felt wrong. Money flowed from struggling churches to wealthy worship enterprises. Fifth, the quality focus created unrealistic expectations. Bethel and Hillsong production was professional and polished. Churches tried to replicate that quality but couldn't. Local worship leaders felt inadequate. The industry made churches dissatisfied with authentic, less polished local worship. The worship industry collapse also revealed theological problems that had been developing for years. First, worship songs became increasingly therapeutic rather than theological. They focused on how worship makes us feel. You make me feel. You lift me up. You give me peace. First-person pronouns dominated. God's objective character, His holiness, His justice, His transcendence, these diminished. Worship became about emotional experience rather than proclaiming truth about God. When the brands collapsed, people realized the songs hadn't taught them theology. They taught them to expect emotional highs. Second, the repetition culture created shallow worship. Industry songs used simple phrases repeated dozens of times. This is how I fight my battles, sung 40 times, doesn't teach Christians anything about spiritual warfare. The songs worked for generating emotional experiences but failed at discipling believers. Third, the songs often taught problematic theology. Bethel's word of faith influences appeared in lyrics about speaking things into existence. Hillsong songs sometimes suggested salvation by experience rather than by grace through faith. Elevation songs occasionally bordered on prosperity gospel with lyrics about God giving us whatever we ask. Fourth, the industry made church worship dependent on external sources. Churches didn't write their own songs or adapt historic hymns. They consumed whatever Hillsong, Bethel, or Elevation produced. When those sources failed, churches didn't know what to sing. The industry had killed local worship creativity. Finally, the worship industry created worship consumers rather than worship leaders. People went to church expecting a performance, professional production, perfect sound, emotional experience. When worship was less polished, people complained. The industry trained Christians to be critics rather than participants. Where does worship music go after the industry collapse? Churches face immediate practical problems. They've removed most Hillsong songs from rotation. They're cautious about Bethel songs. They're questioning Elevation songs. What do they sing instead? Some churches are returning to hymns. Great is thy faithfulness. It is well. Holy, holy, holy. Songs with theological depth and no controversial brands. This works for traditional congregations but feels like step backward for contemporary churches. Younger Christians often resist hymns as boring or outdated. Other churches are discovering smaller, independent worship writers. Artists like Sandra McCracken, Keith and Kristen Getty, and local songwriters. These sources avoid the celebrity worship leader model. They write songs for churches, not for Christian radio. But they lack the marketing reach and production quality that made industry songs so accessible. Some churches write their own worship songs. Local staff or congregation members create music specific to their community. This was norm before the worship industry existed. Could be norm again. But most churches lack the musical talent and theological training to write good congregational worship songs. The CCLI data shows the transition happening. In 2024, older songs from the 1990s and 2000s are resurging. Songs by Chris Tomlin, Matt Redman, and Tim Hughes, pre-industry collapse worship, are being rediscovered. Churches are also singing more hymns and fewer brand new releases. What's emerging is fragmented worship landscape. No dominant brands. No unified contemporary worship sound. Some see this as healthy diversity. Others see it as chaos and loss of quality. What's clear is the era of worship industry dominance is over. What should Christians learn from the worship industry collapse? Lesson 1. Don't build worship around celebrity brands. When worship depends on Hillsong or Bethel, it's vulnerable to their failures. Worship should be rooted in scripture and theology, not in whoever's currently popular on Christian radio. The celebrity worship model was always going to fail eventually. Lesson 2. Commercialization corrupts ministry. The moment worship became industry, profit motive entered. Songs were written for commercial success. Tours generated revenue. Brands built empires. But ministry and business have different goals. Mixing them corrupts both. Lesson 3. Theology matters in worship songs. We become what we sing. If we sing songs teaching bad theology, we'll believe bad theology. Churches must evaluate songs theologically, not just aesthetically or emotionally. Lesson 4. Local worship is better than imported worship. Your church knows your community. Songs written for your context will serve you better than songs written for global markets. The industry killed local creativity. This death might revive it. Lesson 5. Worship is about God, not us. Too many worship songs became about our feelings, our experiences, our needs. Biblical worship focuses on God's character, God's actions, God's glory. The collapse is opportunity to recalibrate toward God-centered worship. Lesson 6. Production quality isn't the point. The worship industry created expectation that worship should sound professionally produced. But worship in Acts was probably off-key, unpolished, and authentic. Value authenticity over production. Participation over performance. Lesson 7. Accountability matters. Hillsong, Bethel, and Elevation lacked real accountability. Leaders operated with minimal oversight. Abuse and error flourished. Any worship ministry needs accountability structures that prevent celebrity culture and financial abuse. What will Christian worship look like in 10 years? Several scenarios seem possible. First, the return to hymns and older worship songs. Churches might conclude that songs surviving decades or centuries have proven theological value. Modern worship might become 25% historic hymns, 50% established worship songs from the 1990s to 2010s, and 25% newer material. This would create stability but might feel stale to younger generations. Second, the rise of local and independent worship. Churches might develop local worship teams writing contextual songs. Independent worship artists unconnected to major brands might fill the gap Hillsong and Bethel left. This would increase diversity but might reduce quality and accessibility. Third, the emergence of new worship brands. The industry might rebuild with different names. Maverick City Music is attempting this, racially diverse, less celebrity-focused, emphasizing authenticity. But they might repeat the same mistakes if financial success again becomes the measure of faithfulness. Fourth, the fragmentation of worship styles. Without industry driving unity, worship might splinter into subgenres. Charismatic churches doing spontaneous worship. Reformed churches emphasizing theological depth. Contemporary churches blending hymns and modern songs. No unified contemporary worship sound. Most likely some combination of all four. Some churches will return to hymns. Others will support independent artists. A few new brands will emerge but won't dominate like Hillsong did. And worship will become more diverse and localized. The era of worship industry dominance is over. What replaces it remains unclear. Despite the crisis, the worship industry collapse creates opportunities. Churches can reclaim worship creativity. Instead of consuming whatever the industry produces, they can write, adapt, and create worship that serves their communities. Local musicians and songwriters can contribute without needing to launch worship brands. The collapse also creates opportunity for theological recovery. Without pressure to use industry songs, churches can choose songs teaching sound doctrine. They can sing more scripture. They can emphasize God's character over emotional experience. They can do worship that forms disciples rather than entertains consumers. The collapse creates opportunity for authentic community. Without comparing your church's worship to Hillsong's production, you can value what you have. Your local worship leader doesn't need to sound like Bethel's album. They need to lead your church faithfully. The industry made churches dissatisfied. Its death might restore contentment with authentic, local worship. Finally, the collapse creates opportunity for humility. The industry made worship about excellence, production, and success. Post-industry worship can be about faithfulness, authenticity, and God. This might be a painful transition, but it's necessary for worship health. From Hillsong to Bethel, the worship industry is dying. Brands that dominated contemporary worship for 2 decades are collapsing. Hillsong bankrupt, Bethel diminished, elevation damaged. The billion-dollar industry that industrialized worship is failing, and churches are scrambling to figure out what to sing instead. This collapse is devastating for many. Worship leaders like Emily, who loved leading, now feel disillusioned. Churches that depend on industry songs don't know what to do. The production quality and accessibility that industry provided is disappearing. The transition will be painful and messy. But the collapse is also liberating. The worship industry commercialized something sacred, turned ministry into business. It made worship about brands, celebrities, and profit. The death of that system creates space for something healthier. Worship that's local. Worship that's authentic. Worship that's about God rather than production. Worship created by communities for communities. Worship free from commercial pressures. Worship that disciples rather than entertains. Worship that teaches theology rather than generates emotion. The industry gave us great songs. Oceans, Goodness of God. What a beautiful name. These helped millions worship. But it also gave us celebrity culture, theological shallowness, and financial exploitation. We gained accessibility and production quality but lost authenticity and theological depth. The question now is what we'll build instead. Will we create new worship industries making the same mistakes? Will we return to older models that worked before commercialization? Will we discover something new that honors both artistry and faithfulness? If this investigation challenged you, convicted you, or changed how you think about worship music, subscribe now. The worship industry collapse is the most significant shift in contemporary Christian worship in 50 years. And how churches respond will shape worship for the next generation. From Hillsong to Bethel, Christian music is dying, at least the commercialized, industrialized version. What emerges from its death will define worship's future. May it be something faithful. May it be something authentic. May it be something that glorifies God rather than building empires. The industry is dying. Let it. And may what rises from its collapse be healthier, holier, and more faithful to the God we worship. Because worship was never supposed to be industry. It was supposed to be ministry. And perhaps the collapse will help us remember that difference.